Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Jason McCray. I'm a clinical psychologist and the Chief Clinical Officer at the Center for Balanced Living, which is the little local specialty clinic that works with folks with eating disorders. And I'm going to talk about dieting and how that can sometimes pave the path toward disorder. Quick show of hands. Raise your hand if you've ever been on a diet before. Really, raise your hands, I mean it. All right, so I'd like you to jot down a couple of words about what the diet was like. What'd you do? How'd you feel while you were on it? Just a couple words. I'll wait. All right. Now I'd like you to think, no need to raise hands on this one, about whether you personally know anyone who has an eating disorder, or even just somebody that you suspect. And similarly, I'd really like it if you jot down a couple of words that come to mind when you think about the person with an eating disorder, or even just the eating disorder itself. Again, jot down these words, please. We'll use them later. Okay, so what do you think of when I say eating disorder? And some folks come up with anorexia nervosa and limiting their food intake, exercising a lot, lots of things like that. Some folks come up with bulimia, which I think most folks are aware of, is when you eat very little sometimes, too much other times, then do something to make up for it, which may or may not be vomiting or exercise or lots of other things. And then there's also binge eating disorder, which is a newer diagnosis that is, again, it can alternate between eating too much and not eating enough, but really it's eating a really large amount of food in a really time-limited period, and more than other folks would. So this isn't like you ate too much at the Super Bowl party. This is, you ate like Thanksgiving, but it's Wednesday afternoon, that kind of thing. All right, so some myths that bear on those things about eating disorders. So eating disorders are mostly about food. Well, actually eating disorders are complex neurobiological reactions to metabolic changes. And we'll talk a lot about that here in a few minutes. Eating disorders are mostly about vanity or choice, trying to control things or wanting to be thin or pretty. No, actually, did I mention that eating disorders are complex neurobiological reactions to metabolic changes? I promise I'll explain what that means in a little bit. You can't exercise too much. More exercise is more healthy, right? No. Exercise and nutrition really need to be in a good balance in order for somebody to be healthy. And going either to too much exercise or not enough exercise for the amount of food that you're taking in actually does all sorts of bad things to your body. One of which is an eating disorder, and then there are all sorts of other bad things that can happen too. Some folks think that only women get eating disorders. Not true. About a quarter of folks with eating disorders are men. And rates are quite high in the trans and gender queer communities as well. And so anytime there's a either gender identity or sexual identity that is out of the mainstream, that seems to dramatically raise the risk for folks developing eating disorders. We don't really know why yet, but there's some real smart people working on it. Only young people get eating disorders, right? Something that like teenagers get. Turns out at the clinic here, the average age of folks in treatment is 37 years old. So I don't know whether you consider that young or not. I don't know that I want to know whether you consider that young or not. But that's the average age. And there's also the idea that if you're an athlete, you can't have an eating disorder, right? If you're just training hard, it's just for your support. Turns out that many athletes actually develop eating disorders, some of them during their competitive careers, but much more often when they end their competitive careers, there's a whole range of things that happen. And eating disorders are one of them, but also dramatic increases in depression and anxiety and other kinds of psychiatric conditions that are an adjustment to ending that competitive career create all sorts of trouble. All right, so there is no eating disorder look. Each of the folks up here could potentially have an eating disorder. So the woman who's very lean, who sees herself as not lean, the obviously emaciated model, the guy who sees himself as much smaller than he is, and so fails to perceive the level of muscularity that he has. Then I'm not sure if this guy has an eating disorder or not, but the hot dog eating contest thing at Nathan's, it's a little sketchy. Can't eat 64 hot dogs, so it's not a good idea. All right, also kind of talking about this eating disorder look. Every one of the images on this screen is somebody who's a world champion in their sport. And so the sumo dude is a world champion. His body is an amazing machine that allows him to do things that nobody else can do. This basketball player, she's a world champion. Her body facilitates her doing amazing things on the basketball court. And cyclists and swimmers and weightlifters. There are all kinds of bodies. All bodies are very different, and there is no look that you can tell whether someone's healthy or not, or whether somebody's athletic or not. So it's really important to get away from these like rigid ways of, oh, well, look at them. Do you even lift? It's not like that at all. Bodies are amazing. Bodies are unique, and every single one of these is the best in the world at their respective sport. It's kind of fascinating to see the range of sizes and shapes that are represented in the group. All right, so how do eating disorders happen? I started off by saying I was going to talk about dieting, and that may or may not relate to eating disorders. Then I even made you write down some words about dieting, just to torture you, or maybe it's going to have something to do with this. All right, so for starters, I just wanted to get this real clear. It's an old misconception. It's even in a bunch of old textbooks. There's not a shred of scientific evidence that, on average, families give people eating disorders. So this isn't about family dynamics or your relationship with your mom or any of those sorts of things, although there are plenty of folks who think that that's what it is. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'm actually going to share with you the state-of-the-art model for how eating disorders happen. So I'm showing you stuff that most people wouldn't get in their college course on abnormal psychology. All right, so there's this idea in psychology that's called the stress diathesis model. Most psychological conditions can actually be explained using a stress diathesis model. And really all that means is that diathesis is the combination of risk factors that create a vulnerability to a condition. And then a stress is something bad that happens that causes that underlying vulnerability to become activated. So post-traumatic stress disorder is one example of this. It may be that because of my childhood and how my brain developed and my genetic inheritance and lots of stuff like that, I'm at really high risk for having a traumatic reaction if something bad happens. Just having that risk isn't enough to get me PTSD. Something bad has to happen, and then I get PTSD. Lots of things in psychology work that way. Many kinds of depression, some kinds of anxiety, and it turns out that this model actually works really, really well to describe eating disorders. So one side of this, the diathesis, is genetics. So we'll talk about some gene stuff. So anorexia and bulimia both appear to be very, very hereditable, meaning that if one of your parents has it, you're likely to be at risk for it as well. So in statistics, there's this fancy thing we do called hereditability coefficients, which basically just means how likely are you to catch something from one of your parents. So for anorexia and bulimia, the estimates range somewhere between 0.5 and 0.8, which means somewhere between half and 80% of the variance. And who gets them? Comes from your genes. That's huge. So to put this in the context, like that's roughly the same range that you see for height. You look at people and you're like, oh, you're tall, you're short. Like you get this from your parents, right? Eating disorders are in exactly the same range. Hereditability coefficients for height range from 0.6 to 0.8. For anorexia and bulimia, they range from 0.5 to 0.8. 0.85 is the value for IQ, which is the most hereditable trait that we track. Eating disorders are usually hereditable, and a good chunk of whether you're at risk for one or not depends from the genetic inheritance that you get from your parents. So this isn't about fault, this isn't about vanity. You can't control your genes. That's just how it is. All right, so there are lots of things that these genes cause, and some of them are alterations to parts of the brain and how they work. So there's a chemical called dopamine that is active in various parts of the brain that gives you pleasure when you eat, and it makes you feel a reward when you seek out food when you're hungry. Folks who have a high risk for eating disorders, one of the things that's true about their genetic inheritance is that their brain doesn't do so well on dopamine in those areas. So they tend not to make you feel particularly good about eating when you're hungry, and they make you not particularly motivated to seek food out, like maybe most other folks would. And what you see is that when folks start to get even just a little bit malnourished, that gets worse. All right, so why do more women than men have eating disorders? Well, it turns out that men and women both have genes, right? So when estrogen surges just prior to puberty, it turns out that there's this whole idea called epigenetics, which is some of your genes are turned on and some of your genes are turned off at any given moment. And when girls at around age 11, 12, 13 start to experience a surge in estrogen, it actually turns on a lot of these genes that are the risk factors for eating disorders. So if you look at small children, the rates of eating disorders are a lot closer to even. It's still more girls than boys, but not by anywhere near the margin. And then when you look at kind of the onset of puberty and after, eating disorders are overwhelmingly female. About 90% of people with anorexia are female, somewhere in the ballpark of 2/3 to 3/4 of folks with bulimia are female, and it's about 50-50 for binge eating disorder. We don't know why. All right, so this is genetic inheritance largely. Carries a lot of implications for how you work with folks who have eating disorders, or how society ought to treat people who have eating disorders. It can help by externalizing the illness. This isn't your fault, any more than if you had a tumor would be your fault, or if you had diabetes would be your fault. This isn't because you were being vain and trying to control things. It's just part of how your body's put together. And it's also key to understanding why it's so hard to change. Because once this kicks in, your brain is telling you to do these things. Like, it's giving you very powerful motivations to keep doing these things. And it's almost like saying, no, brain, don't do what you're going to do this other thing. And doing that every single time you're supposed to eat, all day long, for week after week after week after month after year, for a really, really long time to have any hope of getting better. And it also helps to reduce the blame in the family. I mean, the facts are, most people spend a lot of time with their families. And if you have something wrong, they're probably going to be the people who help you try to fix it. And so, understanding that this genetic inheritance is really the only role that families play on average, and that your family doesn't get to pick the genes that they give you, it really helps to kind of alleviate some of that pressure. So there's some really smart folks working on some international genetic studies to kind of better understand these genetic risk factors and how they work. We're probably 2 to 5 years out from really having a whole lot better answers to this. All right, so there are other kinds of diathesis too, not just genes. So like bad stuff can happen to you, life experiences, and you can be exposed to cultural things that increase your risk of developing an eating disorder. And so life experiences can be part of that diathesis too. It's not just genes. If genes account for 50 to 80%, that other 20 to 50% has to come from someplace else. This is some of those places. So there have been really, really smart people, Michael Levine, Linda Smolak, and lots of other folks who've done incredible amounts of research looking at toxic cultural factors that make people at greater risk for developing eating disorders. And these include exposure to high fashion images, so like Cosmo and Vogue and things like that. There are these fantastic studies that look at, if you ask young women at 16, 17 years old how they feel about themselves and ask them about their mood, then show them as few as 12 pictures from Cosmo and ask them again, immediately after, like 10 minutes later. They feel way worse, they're way more angry, they're way more hopeless, they have a much higher drive for thinness, they think that skinny people are better than they did just 10 minutes ago when you just asked them these questions. It's really easy to use these images to induce very bad changes in emotional state and in self-esteem, with just as few as 12 images. If you flip through one magazine of Cosmo or one magazine of Vogue, there's a whole bunch more than 12 pictures in there. If you watch 10 minutes of television, there's a whole bunch more than 10 pictures there. If you spend 20 minutes surfing the web, you're going to see a whole lot more than 10 of these images. It's absolutely everywhere, and it's a huge risk factor for eating disorders. The other piece that really matters is, so some people see those images and are like, so what? That's not even real. And other folks see it and they're like, oh gosh, well, like compared to her, I look terrible. Or compared to him, I look terrible. So when you internalize that and use that as a standard against which you measure yourself, that's an incredible risk factor. And so there's societal pressures on women and on men to look a certain way and to behave a certain way. There are lots of other things that sort of go into this lived experience risk factor for eating disorders. Also, experiencing a traumatic life event is a big risk factor. Competition in certain sports like figure skating or diving or dancing that have highly subjective rating systems, and that the line or size or shape of the body plays into that, are also huge risk factors. Wrestling is also a big risk factor, although the state's done a whole lot better job in sort of regulating how folks can make weight in order to reduce that. And some medical illnesses contribute risk as well. All right, so all these factors go together, and they go into like this big pot of stew, or this big vat. So some of it's genetics, some of it's accidents of, have you had a head injury or not? What culture have you been living in? To what extent have you internalized these societal messages? Have you experienced a trauma? And what happens is all those go in and they get mixed up, and it gives you your personal risk level for developing an eating disorder. And everyone's got one. So some people are at very low risk, so you get a really long fuse. Some people have a very high risk, and so they get a really short fuse. And what gets that fuse burning is getting malnourished. I'm going to tell you how we know that in just a moment. There was this fantastic study done back in World War II by a guy named Ansel Keys. He was a nutrition instructor at the University of Minnesota. And he studied the effects of malnutrition on the body and on psychology. And this is how we learned that that's what causes the fuse to burn. All right, so different fuses. Some people get short fuses. Some people get medium fuses. Some people get longer fuses. Some people get really long fuses that are mostly burned up, so that person's kind of in trouble. What's this have to do with eating? And what's this have to do with dieting? What's this have to do with eating disorders? All right, so we've got that stress diathesis model. It's the combination of your genetics and lived experiences. And then we've got some sort of a stress, right? Something bad happens that activates those vulnerabilities. Well, it turns out that becoming malnourished for some people, even just a little bit malnourished is what activates those risk factors. And once your fuse is burned up, there are a whole bunch of changes in the brain that really are not good for you. And so we'll talk about how becoming malnourished, often, but not always through dieting. Sometimes it's a stomach flu, sometimes someone has a parasite. There are all sorts of things that can lead you to get malnourished. But by malnourished, we really just mean that you're expending significantly more energy than you're taking in. And that you're doing that to a degree that's greater than your body can take. People's bodies are very different with regard to how much that difference needs to be for you to get into any trouble. And so there are an awful lot of individual factors here that make it hard to generalize. All right, so the Minnesota Starvation Study. This is how we know this malnourished thing. So they took a bunch of conscientious objectors during World War II. These are folks who wanted to contribute to the national service or who had been drafted, but for some reason couldn't fight or risk killing folks. Usually these were folks who had religious objections, but not solely folks who had religious objections. So they took these guys, and there were 36 men who were extensively pre-screened for psychological and for physiological problems. So we knew they had a clean bill of health, both psychologically and physically, at the beginning of the study. And then what they did was for 12 weeks, they had 3,200 calories per day. Sounds like a lot, right? It's not nearly as much as you think. And at the end of the 12-week induction period, just through kind of normal physical activity and eating, all 36 men were at approximately a 22 BMI, so far as height and weight ratio goes. And so really what a 22 BMI means is that's smack dab in the middle of the normal healthy range for young adult males. Then for 24 weeks, they did what was called a semi-starvation phase, where folks ate 1,800 calories per day and had to walk 22 miles per week on top of their normal activities as part of being students who are enrolled at the University of Minnesota. And so what we saw was over those 24 weeks, so approximately 6 months, weight dropped to between 90 and 100 pounds for all of the men. And for all of the men, their BMIs went from being 22, so smack in the middle of the healthy range, to in the low teens, which is incredibly dangerous. And then what we saw was there was 12 weeks of controlled refeeding, which is, hey, if we give people more protein, or if we give people more fat, or if we give people more carbohydrates, how do they most effectively restore weight? And how do they do that in a way that doesn't send their body into toxic shock, which can kill you when you go from being malnourished to starting to eat normally again? Then there were an additional 8 weeks where folks were pretty much permitted to eat whatever they wanted in hopes of getting them back to the way that they'd been at the beginning of the study, which turned out to be way harder than we would have thought. All right, so trigger warning. If anyone is unsettled by pictures of extremely thin men that are emaciated, now would be a good time not to look. There are archival photos from the guys who were in the study just to kind of give you an example of what we're looking at. Really, if this is something that might trouble you, look away now. I'll tell you when you can look again. All right, so the Minnesota Starvation Study. At the beginning of the study, when folks were at a 22 BMI, they looked a lot like this fellow. Reasonable musculature, thin, but not skinny. I mean, just kind of lean and healthy. And towards the end of the study, when they were in the low teens, folks looked like this and like this. I mean, very much they looked like folks who were being liberated from concentration camps, which was actually part of why they were doing this study, was to see how you can safely refeed folks who've been in that situation. All right, you can look again. The pictures are off. All right, so what did we learn? We learned lots of stuff. The published work is just shy of 1,400 pages. Now, for context, most journal articles, when you find out something really spectacular, are like 30 pages. And this is 1,400 pages. It's like in multiple volumes. It looks like an encyclopedia. For our purposes, it's really important to know that all 36 men developed every psychological, emotional, and cognitive feature that are considered to be associated with anorexia nervosa. So men are at 10% the risk of anorexia that women are. And 100% of 36 men developed all the psychological features that are associated with anorexia. What this tells us very clearly is that anorexia nervosa is the side effect of starvation, not the other way around. And this is how we figured out that starting to get malnourished is what causes changes in the brain, not the other way around. So epidemiologically speaking, 1 out of 500 men should have had this reaction to it based off of what we knew prior to the study. 36 out of 36 did. This is a neurobiological reaction in the brain to the body and the metabolism being damaged by getting malnourished. And that's what creates the reaction that we think of as being an eating disorder. And so it taught us that the key features of anorexia are the side effects of starvation, not the cause of starvation. And so when we talk about getting malnourished, that's your fuse burning up. So you got your fuse. through dieting or other means of becoming even modestly malnourished, the fuse starts burning. And when the fuse burns up, you get an explosion. So here's the thing. For some people, if you have a relatively high risk for an eating disorder, it doesn't take very much to burn up that fuse. You could go on the same crash diet that your 5 best friends did to look good for prom, just trying to lose 3 or 4 pounds even. And that could be too much for your unique physiology, and it starts to respond by making these neurobiological changes. Other folks could do crazy diets for a couple of months at a time and not have that same reaction, and it's nobody's fault. It's just part of how your brain and part of how your body are put together. And so this doesn't have to be some extreme, oh my gosh, she's eating only lettuce. And this can be people who are still eating a reasonable quantity of food, depending on what their individual vulnerabilities look like. It could also be that you got a real bad stomach flu, or that you got mono and you were bedridden for a while. There are lots of things that lead people to get malnourished, but once they get malnourished, the brain kind of freaks out and says, oh, hey, there's no food. Like, let me do all these things to try and keep you alive. And back in the hunter-gatherer times and things like that, these were things that would actually kind of help to keep you alive in that situation. Like thinking about food all the time if the herd has moved on, really inconvenient. Thinking about food all the time when there's a supermarket right over there where you could go and buy food, that might make a little more sense, right? But our brains don't change very quickly. They change very slowly. And so once the fuse is burned up, the brain starts to respond to that, and you see this whole cascade of changes where some things fire too much and some things fire too little, and we're really off to the races with the disorder at this point. So an explosion, right? Yeah, really. It comes on very suddenly. Once it starts, it's very hard to stop, and it creates all sorts of damage all over the place if it's left unchecked. And the eating disorder can absolutely wreck people's lives and wreck people's bodies, and ultimately they kill a lot of people. Eating disorders are in fact quite deadly. Out of all the psychiatric conditions that we know of, this is the one that kills more people than any other. More than suicide due to depression, more than bipolar disorder, more than schizophrenia, more than multiple personality disorder, which is called dissociative identity now. More than anything else, eating disorders kill more people than any other psychiatric condition. So about 4% of people who have anorexia are going to die from it. About 4% of people with bulimia will die from it. And about 5% of people with binge eating disorder will die from it, or related consequences medically from the binge eating. Folks who don't get treatment for an eating disorder, about 20% of them are going to die. So if you have an eating disorder and you don't get help, you have a 1 in 5 chance of dying from that. And this whole thing can be set into motion by going on a diet that didn't even look that crazy compared to what everybody else was doing. It's kind of mind-boggling, right? So, very limited data. One study published in 2009 shows that if somebody has anorexia for just 10 years, their risk of dying by suicide increases by a factor of 58.1 times. You are 58 times more likely to die by suicide if you've had anorexia for 10 years. That is shocking. So, any of these mixed with substance abuse gets a whole lot worse in a hurry. All right, so let's revisit those words that I asked you to write down at the beginning. So look at the words about dieting. Look at the words about the eating disorder or the person who has an eating disorder. If I've done my job in these last 25 minutes or so, you might have different thoughts about those words. You might have different reactions to diets, to eating disorders, and you might have just a little bit of an understanding about how dieting, even in a way that doesn't look particularly extreme, can be dangerous for some folks. So for some people, dieting can really just sort of begin this path towards what's ultimately a very deadly condition. And so I implore you, if you're someone who is going to diet, which there's very little scientific evidence to support being helpful, but if you're someone who is going to diet, be careful, keep an eye on it. If folks around you start looking worried, take that seriously, because it's the beginning of the way to some very serious things. Thank you for your time.